Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about saving records to your online family tree. Specifically, we are going to talk about making sure that you save the right record to the right person. Now, there are a lot of ways that you discover records. One of the big ways is through hints, either through your all hint list or through hints that you find as you go through your tree, one person or one family at a time, which by the way is the way I prefer to do that. You also discover records through searching, through suggested records, lots of different ways. I've done some videos previously. I think the last one was called Beyond the Shaky Leaf, where I walk through some of those different ways to discover records. I would encourage you to go back and watch that video if you haven't already. This is kind of the next step in that process, which is once you find a record, how do you save it to your tree appropriately? So let's talk first about evaluating hints. Now this is a really important step because hints are delivered to you in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that hints are delivered to you is through algorithms, where our computers here at Ancestry look at some of the records we have, not all of them, but some of the records, and compare them with information in your tree and deliver up a hint where we think this information might have something to do with the person in your tree. Another way that hints get delivered to you has to do with what each one of you are doing in your family trees. So if someone has attached a record to a tree, and you have then attached that same record to your tree, we will show you the other records that person has attached as hints on occasion. And so what that means is that if you're just attaching hints because you're not sure if it's the right person or because you're brand new and you don't know what you're doing yet, which is fine, we were all new once, but that's informing what happens or what other people are being shown as hints. So a lot of the hints that you're seeing are things that other people are doing in their trees. So it's really important to recognize, first of all, that it's just a hint. It's just a suggestion, an idea that this might be a record you want to look at that might have something to do with your family. So the very first thing you've got to do is you've got to evaluate that hint to determine, is this the right person or not? Now, sometimes you know a lot about the person because it's your dad or your grandpa or your aunt, and you knew these people. And so you can look at a record and you can say, oh, I know that that's not the right record. Just click ignore and move on. Sometimes, if it's somebody further back in your family tree, maybe it's a great-great-grandparent that you never knew, or someone that you just know a little bit of information about, well, then you're not always sure if it's the right person or not. So one of the first things that you need to be aware of is that on every hint that you're reviewing, Ancestry gives you the opportunity when you're reviewing the hint to say, yes, this is my person, no, this is not my person, or maybe this is my person, I'm not sure. And there's nothing wrong with using that maybe button. Just know that if you use that yes button, what happens is now all of a sudden anybody else who looks at any of the records you've attached to this person is going to see these other records you've attached to this person. So we want to really make sure that we're confident in our conclusions. We also want to be confident in our conclusions just for our own sake, because we want to make sure we're climbing our family tree, not somebody else's, because we want to make sure that we're being true to who our ancestors were and that we're correctly identifying them and the events in their life accurately and portraying those accurately. So making sure you evaluate that record and come to understand if this really is the right person or not is a really, really important first step. Now, I've shown this trick before, but I'm going to show it again because it's such a lifesaver for me. Sometimes I don't have enough information to know. Sometimes a single record, actually almost always, a single record is not enough to know if this is my person or if this isn't my person. So one of the little tricks that I use very often is that I will come in here and I will right-click on a link or on a record, and I will open that up in a new tab. And I will right-click and open it up in a new tab. And I'll just go through, every one of the hints sometimes 2 or 3 of them at a time, and I'll just open them up in a new tab. And I don't know if you can see what's happening here across the top of my screen, but I have new tabs that are opening up as I go through each one of these hints. And so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm actually going to drag these hints or these tabs so that they're in chronological order, right? 1850 comes before 1860, then 70 and 80. 1910 should be at the end here. The Civil War happened in the 1860s, so I'm going to move that there. And now what I end up with is this series of tabs that are hints that I can review and compare very quickly to determine if this is my person or if this is not my person. Now, depending on how you got to this person, if you were doing ancestry research, you would have found them going backwards. If you're doing descendancy research, you would have found them coming forward. And so I usually review the hints in the order of the way that I found them. I hope that makes sense. Let me explain what I mean. If I found them doing ancestry research, typically what that means is that I know more about them later in their life and I'm trying to discover things about them earlier in their life. So I'll review the hints at the end of the timeline first because I'm more likely to know if that's accurate or not. Now, if I found them doing descendancy research, meaning I have an ancestor and I'm trying to figure out who all his children and grandchildren are, which is super useful for DNA research, for example, then I'll review the hints starting at the beginning of their life, because again, I'm more likely to know more information from the beginning of their life, they're with their parent, as a child with their parents, and then I'm looking for them as they serve in the military or as they get married and have their own children. So it depends on which direction I come from, determines how the order in which I review the hints. But then I just will review the hints, and again, I'll compare information. And that leads me to the next point, which is make sure you actually review the records themselves. Now, this is what we call a record page, which is just the information off the record that was indexed. Always make sure that you actually, where there's an image, and now Ancestry doesn't have images for everything, we only have images where the content provider, the archive, or the library has given those images to us. But where there is an image, make sure you always review the original image. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because very often the original image has more information on it than the index that we created. And that's just because the purpose of the index is to be a finding aid to get you to the original record. It's not meant to be an exact transcription. And so the original record almost always has additional information. Also, sometimes errors creep in. Anytime a record is copied, it introduces opportunity for error. So always check that original record to see if the information that was indexed is accurate. And then the third reason to look at the original image is because very often it gives you context. I have found situations where somebody was living next door that was a parent or an in-law, and sometimes there's 2 or 3 pages to a particular record. Now, not a census, but sometimes I will still review a couple pages before and a couple pages after. So always view that original record where possible. Do a little bit of analysis. Again, sometimes it's not until you get to this page that you realize, wait a second, this might not be the right guy. So always, always, always review those records as you're going through that process. Now, then at that point, you can decide that you want to save this record to this particular family. Now, in this case, it looks like John is 77 years old. He's living in Arkansas. He was born in Georgia. He's listed as widowed. He's the father-in-law of the head of household. The head of household in this case is Melville Barkley, which leads me to believe, if I didn't know this already, that Margaret then is John's daughter. And then these are the children of Melville and Margaret. Now, one of the tricky things about saving census records, and this is important, so important we'll review it again toward the end of the video. From 1880 through 1940, which is the most recently available census, 1950 comes out in 2022. So from 1880 to 1940, the census listed this relationship of everybody in the household to the head of household. And that's really great because what that typically means is that you can save the record to the head of household, and it will then save it to everyone in the household who has a direct relationship to that person. And that works really well unless you get kind of oddball relationships or relationships that are not direct. So in this case, John is not a direct relationship to the head of household. So direct meaning a direct connection. So an individual's parents or siblings or spouse or children. So because this is an in-law, it's not a direct relationship. So what's going to happen when I click save to this record is it's only going to save the record to John. So if I want to go back and save the record to Melville and Margaret and their children, I could just come back to this record. I could click on Melville, and then I could do a save to a different person in my tree and attach it that way. Now, sometimes the only people listed in the particular record, like this 1880 census, is the head of household, and in this case, 2 of his children. And so I can click yes, and it will walk me through the save or the merge process, where it's going to say, okay, we're going to save this record to John, and we're also going to save it to his children. Now, this is a really important part of this saving the right record to the right person process. One of the things that I see happen a lot is when you're saving records that list multiple people, you end up with duplicate people. And the number one reason that happens is because however this person was recorded on this index is not how you have them recorded in your tree. So in my case, I happen to know that I have all of John's children listed in my tree, or at least I think I do at this point. And what this is telling me is that there is a person listed on this census record as his son, Ulysses G. Lawrence, and I don't have that person in my tree. And so I can click this little button here, and it will add that person to my tree. However, I think he might already be in my tree. Or if I'm not sure, I can click the Not a New Person link, and it will bring up a list of all his children. And I can then go through and I can say, well, do I already have this person in my tree? Well, in this case, I do. So his name, so in later records, actually I think it's an earlier record, in the 1870 census, this young man, born in 1868, was listed as Grant M. Lawrence. Now, here, 10 years later, same kid listed in the census as Ulysses G. Lawrence. Now, if you know anything about history, it's a pretty safe bet, though I might want to do some additional research, that Ulysses Grant Lawrence is actually one person, and that he's just going by one name in one census and one in the other. I find this all the time, particularly in my mother's Southern family, where from census to census, the kids are listed with different names. Sometimes they'll go by a nickname, sometimes they'll go by their middle name, sometimes they'll be called, Junior or Bubba or whatever, right? Sometimes they're just listed by their initials. So when you are saving records, part of the process of making sure you're saving records to the right people in your tree is to make sure that you're not creating duplicates or adding unnecessary people. Now, if you're not sure that this is the same person, don't add it to that person. Create the new person. You can always go back later and merge the duplicate people. And that's what you want to do. You want to merge duplicates. You don't ever want to delete one or the other. Because if you delete one or the other, what happens then is any records you've saved to the person you delete are no longer saved. Whereas if you merge 2 people, now all the records you saved to either one of those profiles gets merged into that same profile and recognized as the same person. Now in this case, I happen to know that this is the same person, so I'm just going to select that. And then I'm actually just right here in the save process going to come over here and change his name to Ulysses Grant M. Lawrence so that I make sure I capture all of his names. Here then is another child, Abraham Lincoln. Clearly we're seeing a pattern in this family of being named after historical figures. And then I'm going to save that to my tree. So when you're saving a record, particularly where multiple people in the family are listed, make sure that you're not adding unnecessary duplicates, creating new people out of that record merge, but also make sure that you're getting it attached to all of the correct people. So then I just close these tabs as I save a record, close the tab, save a record, close the tab. And what happens is eventually you end up right back where you started. Now, I mentioned that 1880 through 1940, there's relationships to head of household listed. What that means is that prior to 1880, in particular the 1850, 1860, and 1870 censuses, you will have an entire household of people with no relationships listed. And so the Ancestry computers are not going to assume how those people are related. You could have two adults that are listed with their grandchildren, or you could have a brother and sister who are adults raising some of their nieces and nephews, or you could have a man with his wife and her children from her previous marriage, so they're not the children of the head of household. Lots of different configurations in households. After 1880, those are super clear because we have those relationships. Prior to 1880, it's a little bit murkier. So you as a researcher have to figure some of that out. And so Ancestry is not going to automatically save the record to everybody in the household. So what that means is I've got this 1870 census here, for example, and if you scroll down, you'll see there's all these people listed in the household. If I click yes to save this record, it's only going to save it to John because the computer doesn't know what the relationship is between these individuals. So I'll tell you my little secret, and I've probably shared this before, but again, repetition doesn't hurt, especially in learning. I use that right-click trick. Use your right mouse button, right-click, open the link in a new tab. So I just work my way through every member of this household, and I right-click and open it in a new tab, and right-click and open it in a new tab, go all the way through the whole household. And again, look at the top of my screen there, you'll see it's opening a new tab. We've got this William Harris here. We've got to figure out how he's related or if he's related. That's a story for another day. So then what happens is I'll save this record to John. Again, you'll notice John is the only person in the household that I'm allowed to save this record to. And I click Save to Tree, and it will save it and attach it to my tree. And then I can close this tab. And now I'm in Julie's tab. And so I can come in here and I have this save button. And so I can save it to someone in my tree. And I can then do a search for her. And it will pull up the information about her and save it to her. And I can just work my way through each one of these individuals in the household, save the record to that person, close the tab. And when all is said and done, I end up back here at my original list. Now, this is important. When you do the tab trick, what that means is that this original tab stays static. And I love that because it means I can refer back to it. It means I don't have to hit my back button a dozen times to remember where I was. However, it's stayed static, which means you've done all this saving and made some changes, and it hasn't changed. You'll notice here, right, Grant's name is still listed as Grant instead of Ulysses Grant. So what you just have to do is just refresh the page so that it takes all those changes you just made, all the records you just added, and it updates them on that particular page. So now you'll see here's the 1870 and 1880 census, and now Grant down here is listed as Ulysses Grant. So make sure that you refresh the page every once in a while if you're using that tab trick. Otherwise, you might think that you're saving things and they're not really saving, and then you'll save them twice, and that creates a whole nother problem. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, let's go back to our list here to make sure we're staying on track. So the first thing you have to do when evaluating hints, make sure that it is the right person. The second thing is you need to look at what information the record provides. So always view that original image where possible. In my case, those of you who spent time with me in these videos, you know that one of the things that I do actually is I create extensive notes. So I'll need to go back now since I've saved that 1880 census and transcribe that census into my notes so that I can keep track of the research that I've done, so that I'm extracting all the juicy goodness out of the record, so that I make sure that I have updated my tree with the appropriate information. I do it in my notes because then I have this singular list of all the records I've found, and I can review them or analyze them in context with each other so that I can come to appropriate conclusions, because we all know very rarely do we have records that all agree about a person's name or birth date. But when you look at the totality of the information off of those records in one place, sometimes it's fairly easy to come to a conclusion and to resolve some of that conflicting evidence that sometimes comes to light. So that's a big tip that I would give you, is always look at what information the record provides and somehow capture that information. And then, of course, make sure if the record needs to be saved to multiple people, like those pre-1880 censuses, that you're saving it to all the people that are referenced in the record. Now, we don't want to save the record for John to everybody in the family. Remember, we want to click through to each member of the family listed on the record and save it if it doesn't do it automatically. 1880 to 1930, it will do it automatically for anybody who is immediately related to the head of household. Okay. Let me just give you some additional tips. We've mentioned this one prior to 1880, relationships not included on the census, so you'll have to save the record to each person in the household. There's another nuanced record save situation that comes up, and I'm seeing it come up more and more often lately because Ancestry is getting more and more birth, marriage, and death records online, and it's this. If a birth, marriage, or death record lists multiple people, be sure to save the record to the focus person first, and then decide if you want to save it to the other people mentioned on the record. Now, here is what I mean by that, okay? Very often, let's talk through this and then I'll show you some examples. Very often, you will have an individual's birth record, for example, and then it will list both of their parents. Now, sometimes you will get hints on all three people that lead back to this same record. But the record is really for this child being born, okay? Similarly, we see that in marriage records. You have a couple being married, and then you will see that all four parents, the parents of the bride and the parents of the groom, are listed on that particular record. And sometimes you'll get hints in various places, depending on, again, how the computer algorithms that are serving up hints are working and what other people are doing in their tree and how they're saving those records. Sometimes on a marriage record, you'll just have the bride and the groom listed, and sometimes you'll get the hint and it's reversed. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But the idea is you need to look at that record carefully. It's part of that record analysis and determine who the focus person is. Who is this record really about? Is it about the bride and groom? Is it about the person being born? Is it about the person who died? And that record, again, might list their parents and a spouse. So you've got 3 or 4 people listed on a single record. So you have to decide, again, who this record is for, and you have to decide how you're going to save that record, because how you save that record will inform your future hints and will inform the hints of other people. So we're going to look at Rena Shipman here, and if we go into her hint list, one of the things you're going to see, we're going to look at 2 specific examples here. The first one is this hint here for the U.S. Social Security Application and Claims Index. Now, I love this database. It's fantastic because it lists the parents' names. And so when you're looking for an individual, particularly where you're looking for women's maiden names or the maiden names of their mothers, this is a gold mine of information. Now, I happen to know, because I've spent a lot of time with this, that even though I'm seeing a Social Security Claims Application and Index hint on Rena, and Rena's name is listed, I know that this record isn't for Rena. And the reason I know that, besides the fact that I already peeked at it, is because there's no other information listed here. If this record was for Rena, it would likely list her death date, maybe her birth date and place, right? There would be other information listed right here on this hint. So when I click and go to review, I'm going to get even more information about this particular hint. So in this case, you'll notice again, Rena is listed, but there is a spouse listed and a child listed with no dates and no locations. What that tells me is this record that I am looking at is a referral record, not for Rena, but for her child. So if I click on this child, you'll notice now this is the Social Security Application and Claims Index record for Levada. Levada has had several names. She was born in Ivy, and then she married a Pierce, and then she married a Smith, and then she married a Pierce, and her parents are listed here as Little Ivy and Rena Shipman. It's got her birth date in place, it's got her death date. Down here it has the date when she applied for Social Security and the dates on which she changed her name, so likely those are clues about when she got married. Like I said, love this set of records. But this record is for Levada. It is not for her parents. So the reason we got a hint to Rena is because somebody somewhere has saved this record to Leveda and to both of her parents, which makes perfect sense because this record serves as a piece of evidence that these are the names of her parents. And so it's a source for the relationship between this individual and her parents. You may choose not to save every reference record, but that is entirely your choice. The thing I want to get clear or make clear is just make sure that when you do save this record, that you're saving it to the focus person at the minimum. If you also then want to save it to the parents that are listed, you can do that as well. As a matter of fact, as part of this process, it will walk you through that when I go to save the record. It will list the individual and their parents, and I can save it that way. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Some people it gets a little confusing, but again, just remember, if you see a record where there is no dates or places or any other information than a few names, try clicking on some of those names, right, and see what happens, see where it takes you, and I think you'll start to understand how that works. Now, there is one other scenario I want to talk about before we wrap up today. So if we go back here to these hints for Rena and her husband, John Little here, they were married in Missouri, and she also was married she was married an additional time. And so she married John Little, Ivy, and then she married Samuel Ward. And so we have these hints for her marriage to Samuel Ward. So you can see here, this Missouri marriage record. Here's Rena Ivy marrying Samuel Ward. There's some information here. Okay. If you scroll down this list, let's see if I can find it again. Maybe it's back up this list. Here we go. Okay, you can see these two marriage records right here. And one of them, it lists Samuel Ward with a spouse named Rena Ivy, and one of them it lists Rena Ivy with a spouse named Samuel Ward. Now this record is likely the exact same record flipped on its head. Okay, so again, when two or more people are mentioned in a record, Ancestry creates a record for each person to make it more findable. And that's awesome, except that what this is showing me is that somewhere someone has saved this record for Samuel to Rena. And so that's why we're getting a hint for the Samuel record. And then Ancestry is showing us this hint for the Rena record. So always make sure when you save a record, okay, if I come out here and view this Samuel record, that you're saving it to the focus person. Okay, so in this case, Rena is my person that I'm working with. It shows up here at the top of the screen, but this record is for Samuel. Now, Rena is mentioned on the record, so if I want to save this record to Rena, I just click on her name, it flips the record and she becomes the focus person, and then I can save it to her. Hopefully that makes sense. That was a lot of information, but the key is we're giving you as many ways into the records as possible because we have 20 billion historical records. We're adding an average of 2 million new records every single day. That quickly becomes a little bit overwhelming to sort through and sift through. So we want to provide you as many ways into the records as possible. You just need to make sure that if you are saving that record, that you're saving it to the right person. Now, my final tip for the day. Sometimes, like in that case of Samuel Ward and Rena Ivy, you will get a hint that is not for the person that you're looking at, but is for someone else in your tree. I'll come back to this screen here so you can copy that information down, but let's just go back to this right here. Let's just say that I didn't have a hint here for Samuel Ward, but this record is for Samuel Ward, right? But I'm looking at Rena Shipman, but I want to save this record to Samuel Ward. Well, my only options here are yes, this is Rena, no, this isn't Rena, or maybe this is Rena. None of those are applicable. So if I want to save this record to Samuel, there's a really quick and easy way to do that. Instead of having to go out and search the Missouri Marriage Records database to find the record for Samuel so that I can save it, I can just come up here into this URL. Now this URL is a huge long string of numbers that includes information about the DB ID, that's the database ID, and it includes information about the tree ID, and it includes information about the person ID in your tree, And then it has this hint ID. And it just is this little part of this URL right here that starts with AND-HID, stands for hint ID. So starting with that ampersand, if you just highlight everything to the end of the URL, now watch really carefully what's going to happen. See how I have these yes, no, maybe buttons here? I'm just going to delete all of that and hit enter. It's going to refresh this record, and now I have a save button. And so I can then save it to Rena, not what I want to do. I can save it to someone else in my tree, find Samuel, attach this record directly to him. Okay, so get rid of everything in the URL after and hint ID allows you to basically take that record, make it into just a normal record instead of a hint, and save it directly to your tree. For some of you, that might be a little bit more advanced. Don't freak out, it's okay. But for those of you who feel comfortable doing what you're doing, play with it, right? That's the thing, is that until you actually click save on a record, you're not going to mess up anything in your tree. So don't be afraid to click on the record, click on the links in a record, view the image, play around with some things. If you get lost, you can always go back. You can always just refresh and go back to the original person in your tree and try again. But once you learn some of these little tips and tricks, I am super confident that it's going to make not only your experience a lot more fun, but it's also going to make your research and your family tree a lot more accurate. And of course, that's important because we always want to make sure that we are honoring our ancestors correctly, that we're identifying them correctly, that we're not attaching parents or spouses that never were part of their family, and that we're climbing our own family tree and not somebody else's. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.